welcome everyone. I'm Jose Maria Areilza from Aspen, Spain, and I'm very happy to participate in this event that we're producing jointly with our friends from Deusto Business School, Deusto University. Thank you, Juan Moscoso del Prado. And special thanks to Dacey, who is going to be our speaker, a towering figure in American politics, who is both an academic and a longtime practitioner. And as we always do in Aspen, we're trying to create a space for dialogue, for reflection, for understanding the world, for going deeper into the best ideas. And the issue cannot be more pressing and exciting. What's going to happen in the next US elections, less than 8 days to go. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Matt Browne, for a very good friend, for agreeing to introduce Amy. And I welcome all participants. I hope you can hear me well, and we're also looking forward to your questions that you can write in the question and answer box. Thank you so much, and I turn the floor to Juan.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. If you are in the US of America, buenas tardes, si estáis en España. I want to welcome you to this event that we are today producing jointly in Deusto Business School, Deusto Asuntos Globales, and Aspen Institute España. So I want to thank Jose Maria Areilza for this joint initiative that we are producing. And of course, I want to welcome Amy Dacey, she's here with us today, this afternoon. And now I want you to introduce you to Matt Browne. Matt has helped us to convince Amy to be here today. Matt is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and he is the Global Progress founder. Thanks, Matt, for your help, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you, Jose Maria, and everyone at Aspen. I guess I'm also joining this as a member of the Deusto Business School International Advisory Council. And it is my honor to introduce my good friend, Amy Dacey. For those of you who don't know Amy Dacey, let me just take a few minutes to introduce you to her. Amy Dacey right now is the executive director of the Sine Institute of Policy and Politics at American University. But prior to that, she has had a very illustrious career in democratic and progressive politics in the United States. She's advised people such as President Barack Obama, Senator John Kerry. Indeed, during the 2016 presidential election cycle, she was the chief executive officer of the Democratic National Committee. Prior to that, she had been the president of AKD Strategies, which is a strategy firm that works with progressive causes, think tanks, and movements. But of course, long before that, she got her start in Democratic politics as an advisor to Senator John Kerry during his presidential campaign. And after that, she also worked for Emily's List as the executive director. For those of you who don't know Emily's List, it is a fantastic progressive organization that works to help get women elected up and down the ticket in the United States of America. Amy has been a great friend of progressives and around the world and the transatlantic dialogue. And so we're delighted that she has agreed to join us here this evening for this debate. Amy, thank you. Thank you again, Juan and Jose Maria, and the floor is yours, Amy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Matt. It's always a pleasure to do anything with you. I learned so much, and I appreciate all the work that you've done and helped me to make connections internationally, because as I realized, and thank you, Juan and Jose Maria as well, to join. All eyes are watching on what's happening in the next 7 days, certainly in the United States. I just want to give a brief overview. I'm sure there's a lot of questions about this election. I was telling everyone that I think the word unprecedented in America is starting to lose its meaning because we use it every day to talk about this election. But where we're at now, we can talk about the state of play in the United States. Voting will end, polls will close across the country on November 3rd, but early voting is underway in more than 40 states in the United States. We've seen 64 million people have voted so far in the United States. And to put that in perspective, 58 million voted in total early voting in 2016. So we've got a week more to go in the election and 64 million people have already made their choice. We've seen in some states people early voting in person, some are doing mail-in ballots, and some are certainly doing drop-off. We also expect a high unprecedented turnout on election day. What's really important is in several of the early, early votings happening in these battleground states. As you know, in the United States, with our electoral college system, some states will have a large significance in this election. We're thinking about states like Florida, Michigan, certainly Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Most of these states are voting early. The bigger question is, as they trend more 51% to 31%, we've seen in D versus R on some of these ballot requests, what impact will this have on the election? The other thing I think that's really important to note is that polling, although just a snapshot in time of the elections, from impeachment to plagues to recessions to lockdowns, possible locusts, super spreader events, and on the White House lawn, national and battleground polling for Vice President Biden has had a durable national 6 to 14 point lead. And in several of the battleground states, he does see a 1 to 2 point, sometimes a 6 point advantage in some of these states as that's changing. I don't think anybody is underestimating how difficult this would be and how much more we have to do in the last 7 days to see Biden be victorious. But I think some of these indications early on of the consistency, even after the conventions, after the most recent debates, these numbers have held strong. The other thing that's very unique and what could have a very big impact on this election is the mail hypocrisy. President Trump has attempted to discredit the mail-in voting in Dem states while his family and staff are voting by mail. He's encouraging it in Florida, where GOP has a Rust mail-in operation. But some of this rhetoric about discrediting the election has certainly been going on for a while in the president's speeches and in his remarks and on his Twitter feed. And that's something that we are watching certainly with eagle eyes on that. There's litigation. I think people underestimate how much of the election is happening through litigation. Currently, there's 30 active cases that the Democrats are running in several of these states. States with cases, there's 12 states looking at, and a lot of these center around ballot drop-off locations. Something in Pennsylvania we call naked ballot issues, where the security sleeve not being on the ballot can call into question. Witnesses for absentee ballots removed. So much of this is happening through litigation. I was just talking to Matt before this about a recent Supreme Court ruling in Wisconsin saying that only ballots received on election day and not postmarked on election day will have a big impact when we see in Wisconsin, even though there's been a lot of early voting there. We still see signs that foreign interference in the elections and online misinformation could influence the election. And that's something that we saw in 2016 and we'll see, possibly again here in 2020 and might have an impact. Just some interesting historical trends. There's been super disruptions in America since 1900, recessions or pandemics, mass protests, intense elections in 1919, 1957, 1968, and again in 2020. But 2020 is the only one who's had all four. The others had just three. So you've seen financial crisis, healthcare crisis, social unrest all coming together around this national election, and it's having a large impact. A very interesting note, again, in the polling is that nearly 3 in 4 Americans say America is on the wrong track. If you're an incumbent, that's a warning sign about how people might vote. If the country is seen as on the wrong track, it's a reflection of the current leadership, and that's certainly something that people are looking at. A choice election versus a negative referendum. Choice being Trump wins if it's a choice on his 4 years, like Bush in 2004 and Clinton in 96. But if it's a negative referendum, Biden wins on Trump like Reagan in 80 or Clinton in 92. So this is something that is going to have, an importance there as well. Again, recent polling average has 11 points nationally and over 50% for Biden. Clinton never had a national average over 50%. Again, interesting indicators, does not tell us what's going to happen on election day, but shows some disparity between what happened in 2016. Biden's national personal favorable versus unfavorable is 46 to 45. Trump's personal favorable versus unfavorable is 43 to 55. So no longer a challenger, no longer somebody who's challenging the system in an open seat election. President Trump is the incumbent, and so how he's seen in his favorability is certainly having an impact on this election. In some of the key swing states, Biden has been plus 50 in 3 states that Trump carried by only 77,000 votes in 2016. That's Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And I'm sure as many of you heard, all eyes are on these states coming up for election day. Many toss-up states that Trump carried in 16, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Ohio, Texas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Arizona, Alaska, are now in play. I think one thing that's really interesting and important to note, that Biden, Vice President Biden has President Donald Trump playing defensive in some states that he won in 2016, in Georgia and Iowa. And an interesting thing, we always in the United States want to put Texas in play, and we want to say, you know, it could be turning blue, as we say. But one interesting indicator in the early votes, in 2016, in the youth vote overall, 1.2 million youth voters did early vote. And at this point in 2020, 5.3 million have placed an early vote. That's a 342% increase over 2016. And I think in Texas alone, voters under the age of 30 have voted in Texas about 250,000 already. That's 66% that did not vote in 2016. So in the Biden playbook, bringing in new voters, bringing in young voters is critical to the path forward. And I think we're seeing some of this in some of these earlier states. I think the other, you know, again, polling is important, but if you look at the Biden campaign strategy, build back better is the motto. The core message is to calm the waters, curb the virus expansion, restore the economy and jobs, and expand healthcare. Certainly in the polls, Biden's had a clear advantage in national and swing states, as we mentioned. He's had a very disciplined campaign, few leaks. He raised $383 million in September, $364 million in August. That's 77 million cash on hand versus 62 million for Trump. So resources have been able to let him play in more states. Certainly the challenges of campaigning in a COVID environment, you know, how you move those resources around and what they're spending it on, not on in-person rallies and events, but some of the media and the ability to get to voters directly and micro-target, they've been able to do with their resources. And again, as I said, Biden wins the Electoral College if Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, states that weren't run in 16, you know, go to his favor. These toss-ups of Arizona, Georgia, Iowa, putting these states in play certainly gives him more electoral opportunities. While the Trump campaign, you know, to his path to re-election, he can lose 36 electoral votes and still win re-election. So there's still a pathway, certainly for President Trump. He's got a historically low approval rating going into this election. I think not in 2016. Trump has yet to turn the race into a referendum on Joe Biden like he did on Hillary Clinton. Even Biden's favorabilities are much higher than Clinton's were in 2016. So you see some disparities in from 2016. And a big question is, where did the resources of the President Trump's campaign go? They said they had over $1 billion to go, and he spent before voting started. And Biden now has a 3-to-1 cash advantage over the president. So will those resources come into play in these days coming up? There's certainly a lot of different potential election outcomes, but I think a lot as you look and going through, you know, the battleground states, there is a path where Vice President Biden doesn't have to win Florida, but can still win. Pennsylvania is crucial to President Trump's being able to win re-election. I think you've seen him spend time there. Interestingly enough, Vice President Biden was in Georgia today. Again, noticing where they are traveling, when they are traveling, and what states they're going to is certainly important. You know, Biden's initial focus would have been, you know, would be stabilizing the U.S. pandemic response and the economy. He certainly talked about other issues you saw in the last debate, but literally having a solution for what's happening with COVID, a path to move forward and getting back to financial stability has certainly been the key priorities in the Biden campaign. And you've seen that through their messaging, both at events, on TV, and through their individual messaging to voters. And again, under Trump, U.S. influence on the world stage is certainly waned, creating this power vacuum. There's been a lot of questions about his foreign policy. Biden's top objectives, he's been very clear about reestablishing the United States as a world leader, renewing U.S. commitment, to its allies, rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. These are all things that he's talked about in his campaign, certainly moving forward. That's certainly the presidential campaign. Also, the fact that the fight for Senate control has put some states definitely, into play. There's a pathway to try and get to a majority in the Senate. And, currently that's 53 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and 2 independents. 35 Senate seats are up for grab in 2020, 23 of them being Republican seats, 12 of them being Democratic seats. Those places, where there are competitive races, like in Georgia, like in Arizona, certainly could have an impact both on the top of the ticket and certainly down ballot in some of these Senate states as well. I think the important, piece to look at is, in the House as well, some of these individual districts are in some of these key battleground states, and that will continue on. But I will say that in just closing, so we can get to more questions, there's a few things that I'm going to look at on election night that are very important. And if somebody is trying to evaluate what's happening election night in the days before, I would just make sure that I would point to things like states that count ballots before election day. There's been a lot of conversation in the United States about what we will know and when we will know it. In Florida, that process begins, these mail-in ballots, 22 days before the election, they can start counting them. We should have information about what's happening in Florida on election night. Arizona starts that process 2 weeks before the election. North Carolina on September 29th. Texas, its largest counties can begin processing absentee ballots 12 days before the election. You'll see also in Georgia that mail-in ballot voting available to all voters, they're allowing processing of the ballots 2 weeks. And then in Ohio as well. This is not the case for some of these battleground states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. But I think some of those states that if we see the returns and we know more on election night could be a big indicator of what's going to happen. The other thing is this, we call them the Sun Belt states. Several of the early indicator states are in the Sun Belt. These states tend to lean conservative historically and did vote for Trump in 2016. These are the Alabamas, Arizonas, Alaskas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, New Mexico, parts of California, North Carolina, and Nevada. But Biden is either ahead or competitive in several of these states. So according to recent polls, and as the president's support among seniors, and you've seen college-educated suburban, voters and women is declining, some of these Sun Belt states could be an indicator of how the election's going for both Vice President Biden and for President Trump. And again, as I said, Florida does not have to be necessarily the decider on election in 2020. Biden could still be competitive if Trump were to carry Florida and Arizona. Biden would need to win every state that Hillary Clinton won in 2016 and flip Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, each won by Trump in 2016. But again, looking at the individual battleground state polling, that's a possibility, especially as we look into that. I think the other thing that you've heard a lot about is this beware of the red mirage, we're calling it. Election night numbers in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin are likely to favor Trump because of a possible advantage for Republicans with in-person voting on election day. Trump could be ahead in these states only to be replaced by what we're calling a blue shift as mail-in ballots, which may have said could be potentially skewed 2-to-1 for Biden or eventually counted. This is something that we're looking at and have to forewarn people as we're figuring out what the results are. And the gray states region, of course, as I mentioned before, matters a lot. Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, all eyes are certainly on Pennsylvania. And Trump won in 2016, but they're essential to win in 2020. And again, Ohio voters in their state have correctly picked the every single US president since 1964. So these are things that I'm looking for definitely on election night. The other thing, because of this red mirage, We're very concerned about the media making any early predictions on election night. You know, as we kind of polls close across the country, it's really important, especially with so many mail-in votes and early votes being tabulated, that media has to make sure not to make any early predictions that any candidate can capitalize on as we make sure every vote is counted. And then there's just the breakdown, and I'm happy to share this information with people after as well, as just don't look just at battleground states. There's literally individual counties within these battlegrounds that matter. A lot of them is county by county when you go in these states. If Biden can win a few percentage points off of Republican strongholds in Florida, like Naples and Pensacola, and a senior development known as the Villages, it could make the difference in Florida. So this really will go down to county by county. An increase in turnout in heavily minority areas like Flint, Michigan, after it sagged in 2016. If Biden could increase the margins here, it could have a huge impact. In addition, he would need to shrink the margins in GOP-leaning areas in Pennsylvania, such as Lancaster and York and northern Pittsburgh suburbs. But if you look at those counties and how whether the results are coming in on election night, it's important to note. I think another important thing is, it's interesting. One question I will say is, we haven't quite seen the impact of many campuses, university campuses, being virtual in 2020 as well. There are some schools that are major universities in counties that matter: the University of Florida, the University of Michigan, University of Wisconsin. They're in these counties where the turnout model really matters. And this is where a coronavirus pandemic has showed certainly logistical chaos in some of these universities. And if they are not in person, you'll have fewer students to organize. A lot of times organization on these campuses was key to find these important vote margins in these counties. I will say that, you know, those are the things that I'm looking for. I'm cautiously optimistic. There's still so much to be done, you know, in these days leading up to the election. And again, I think the most worrisome thing is how much litigation we're doing, how much we're looking at making sure every vote is counted, some of the misinformation that's been put out there about voting. You've seen the long lines, you know, across the country. People are staying in them and going to vote, but there's been a lot done to try and limit that. And so I think that's something that we're really looking at. But the huge increase in voter turnout, especially early voting and voting in person, could be an advantage. And we will see what the turnout numbers are on election day. So that's just some things I'm looking at and some things to keep in consideration as we have a national election, and certainly we have races in the Senate and the House and down ballot in a lot of state legislatures as well. So there's a lot at play here this election year.
Thank you so much, Amy, for these introductory remarks. I wanted to start, if I may, with the first question, and I encourage all participants who want to ask a question to use our Q&A box, preguntas y respuestas.
Yeah.
That will be open for you. The first question is also about an unprecedented issue, and it's the confirmation today of Amy Barrett as Supreme Court Justice. What effect could this rush confirmation against a lot of procedural norms of the Senate and against convention? What effect could it have on voters' turnout? In 2016, one of the reasons that many conservative Republicans voted for Trump was not his charming personality, it was his promise to put conservative judges on the federal bench on the Supreme Court. Could we see now a reverse effect with the confirmation of Barrett? So more Democrats will be, motivated to go and vote?
I think and certainly Democrats are trying to use this as a motivation. They didn't ask for, this scenario, but I do think it's helped them to say what is actually, on the ballot. It is power and control over Supreme Court nominations that in turn make decisions on women's health, certainly the fate of Obamacare. These are things that they're talking about and discussing. And I think the other thing that you will find is some of these senators that did vote are in some of these targeted states. Some of them are on the ballot. How that plays out in a state like Maine where Senator Collins, voted in a certain way. I think that will be of interest. I think these controversial issues help to bring out, turnout on both sides sometimes. So I do think it has energized the Democratic base as a reminder about why voting matters and that voting has consequences. I think that President Trump's campaign is trying to use this as promises made, promises kept. That, Trump is a man of his word, that he said that he was going to make sure that there was justices on the Supreme Court that were conservative and held, their values. And so both campaigns are trying to use that, I think, at this time. But I do think it'll be a motivating, factor for the polls. I think when it was announced that they were going to try and move this forward, I do think people understand what's at stake. It's a good way to reach out to young voters too, in a civics education way, to explain to them why these have, consequences as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. We have several questions regarding basic issues that have been discussed or going through the campaign. For example, the matter of polarization, and we would like maybe to hear some more about what you think is happening with the white population with college degrees that basically voted for Democrat 4 years ago versus the white population with non-college degrees that voted for Trump. I mean, is there a movement in those big blocks towards the center or towards Biden and Harris? Thank you.
Yes, it's a great question. I think there are traditional voting blocks sometimes with individual parties that certainly tend to turn out more for them. I think, as many of my colleagues in polling would say, they should not be considered what we call base voters, but they're still persuadable. I think what you're seeing is the college educated, voters that did vote Democratic in 2016. There's been certainly a high propensity for Democrats to try and turn out those voters and to get them voting for Vice President Biden. I think when you also see some of the voting blocks that voted for Trump in 2016 that you mentioned, I think it's really important that they've, now he's had 4 years of a presidency and of a record and to show what he's actually done. And I think in some cases, there's definitely where you see individuals who aren't happy with the job that he's done, aren't happy with their current situation, tying President Trump to whether or not you are better off than you were 4 years ago is really important in some of these voting blocks as well. And I think what's really important, what's interesting to me, is to see President Trump in a lot of respects try to use his playbook from 2016 to engage the same voters, to have the same conversation. And as we know, you can't play out the last election. You have to play out this election. And there's a lot of factors that are different. He has a record. He's a sitting incumbent. He has a different, opponent. The world's in a different place. We've got some new voters coming in. We've got some enchanted voters from 2016 who are second guessing their vote. And there's definitely been some turnout of people who didn't vote in 2016 because they were turned off, who are engaged this time. So I think all of those factors you have to come into play. I think suburban women who did vote for Trump in a lot of respects, we've seen some attrition there, and whether or not that translates on election day. I think he's trying to use divisive issues like around protests that happen and safety and security issues to try and engage them. And you see this definitely in his messages and his issue ads to try and do this. But, in 2016, it was about anger and anxiety and angst, and President, Trump tapped into that and he caused division, and he's trying to do that again to get to the numbers that he needs to. Whether that's going to play out in states that are suffering, like the Michigans, Wisconsins, and Pennsylvanias, who've been hard hit by the financial ramifications and the issues of the global pandemic, especially as you see a surge in some of these areas, remains to be seen. But his playbook and his voting blocks and who voted for him in 2016, he can't just turn out that block and still, win. I think that there's a lot of things that are different than in 2016.
Thank you, Amy. There's a lot of interest in getting your analysis on the oil question. As you said, Joe Biden has run a very disciplined campaign, and he's been able to position himself almost above party politics, as almost like a grandfather figure, against a figure that is full of fury and enjoys breaking the rules and transgression. So far a very disciplined, very self-contained campaign. Was it a mistake in the second debate not to clarify what his views about the oil industry were? Just to answer very shortly a question from President Trump that now President Trump is using in places like Pennsylvania or Texas to win the vote?
Well, I do think that it was something that he tried to clarify the next day, but you did see President Trump immediately try to jump on this and use it in some of these states that people's livelihood mattered on this. As you mentioned, some of these Rust Belt states, Texas, I think that Vice President Biden's tried to clarify that. He's certainly also using surrogates in those states that know him and have talked to him about those issues. But in an interesting way, there's a pro and con for everything that gets said. They said, in some respects, some of the people who were moved by environmental issues were really engaged and excited by that. But I think that he tried to talk more about getting rid of the subsidies the day after and clarifying. But I do think that whether it's too late, President Trump is trying to utilize that to have some targeted conversations in some of these battleground states.
Mm-hmm. We have several questions also regarding the economy. In 2016, it wasn't easy for Hillary Clinton to put forward an economic message, since it was sort of continuity with Obama's presidency, and probably Trump expected that this election would take place in a frame of very good economic situation and in a very different situation that was what has been happening since the COVID. What do you think about Vice President Biden's economic proposals and Trump's idea of that he is the only one who can run the economy despite the very complicated situation that the economy is going through right now? This is what they are.
I think it's a great question because, again, this is where there's a difference between 2016, which was an open seat, but still had the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton answering for some of the policies of the last 8 years, right? But then fast forward to 2020, and what we have is a president that, inherited a lot of work that happened over 8 years to help build the economy. Things were kind of, going well for some people in the economy. But again, because the inaction, and I think this is the messaging of the Vice President Biden's campaign, the inaction and the missteps around handling the COVID crisis, small businesses, certain industries have been hard hit by the financial ramifications of COVID-19, and where he could separate himself out before and say he was a businessman and he knows how to do this better. And, in 2016, he's literally responsible for the unemployment numbers. He's literally responsible for the hard hit times for some of these small businesses and some of these industries who've had to furlough workers, where we've seen changes and some of this. So I think for him, it's harder to be the champion of the economy when all these problems are in place and he's not addressing the core issue. And that is getting this global pandemic, in a way that we're acting responsibly and moving forward. And I think that's had implications. And I think that definitely the Democratic campaign is interested in making sure people are aware that his decisions led to some of the challenges we've seen economically right now. And to just say that he's got the greatest economy or to just make blanket statements, it's not what people are feeling. And we always say in the United States that, these are kitchen table issues, we call them. They're what people, they're when they used to use actual checkbooks, checkbook issues, because it's about people's individual lives and do they feel secure? We've got challenges with certainly higher education, a lot of these individuals that are separated from their families during this crisis. This all leads to this, and it's hard for him not to take responsibility. And certainly at the same time, not even lay out solid proposals. You saw in the last debate, again, there weren't plans on how this administration was going to handle the COVID crisis. There weren't plans on how he was going to get the economy moving again. There weren't plans on how he was going to improve the healthcare that he says is not working for Americans. So that's what I think people have to make a choice about. And it'll be very interesting how voters who might have supported him in 2016 see things differently.
Thank you, Amy. The issue of race and immigration was very present in the 2016 election. Things have changed, but President Trump has brought again these two issues to the front of the campaign. What is the effect of this conversation? Not an easy conversation about race and immigration in the polls, in the numbers that you're seeing.
I think what you saw certainly was the Trump campaign's use of the immigration issue to divide in 2016. He wanted to look to who his voting bloc was and say, if you have hardship, if you have difficulties, it's because this group of people have taken advantage of the system or did not play by the rules while you were. And I do think that that's what he used. And again, this time with the protests, with the social unrest, with, asking the tough questions about criminal justice in this country, I think, again, he's trying to create that as a divider, that if you're feeling that you're at a disadvantage, it's because this group is causing that. And so it is difficult. I do think that, some of the individuals has seen, that he's not creating solutions or creating a dialogue that's positive and inclusive. You even saw in the last debate, questions asked like, what would you say to America in your inaugural speech? And, Vice President Biden clearly said that I'm a president for all Americans, not red Americans, blue Americans, certain race, ethnicity, like I'm the president for all Americans. And I think that's one of the mistakes that President Trump also made. He literally saw himself as only a president to the individuals that elected him on 2016, and certainly didn't try to reach out to more individuals. That division helped him in 2016. I don't think it's an asset to him on these issues like social justice, on these issues like immigration in 2016 or 2020, I'm sorry.
We have several questions also regarding foreign policy. And from the perspective that it seems that it hasn't really been at the core of the debate in this campaign, but many things have happened during these 4 years of Trump presidency regarding foreign policy. His attitude towards the European Union or NATO, the trade wars, of course, China, the situation with China regarding trade and other things, the US dropping the Paris Agreement regarding climate, and other matters. Of course, from our perspective, we are looking forward for a change. If it can help to recover some old attitudes and cooperation is so important for Spanish as Europeans and European Union members. What do you think of this? Do you think this last days, there can be some debate about this, or we're just going to maintain this in a low profile until the end of the campaign?
Well, I think it's interesting. There's been, some debate on whether or not U.S. voters think about foreign policy or international issues when they're making decisions, to vote. But I do think what we've seen is a breakdown in diplomacy and the use of, the United States being, a partner in countries all across the world. And in a lot of respects, I think that you've even seen whenever the president is not performing well on something, it's you have to find who there is to blame. And certainly with, the global pandemic, it was China, and he, latched onto that to try and help justify his actions, his, response to that as well. I do think that, these issues are important to some, core voters. I do think that people voting in the United States want to be, safe at home, but are also respected in the world. And I think that I think a lot of you might have seen that so many former diplomats, former security advisors, from both parties have talked about the impact that the Trump foreign policy has had on the United States' ability to lead and to get things done. And so seeing all these experts and seeing all these individuals from both parties kind of weigh in on that, I think it could have some impact in this election. And I think going forward, as I mentioned before, I also think that, this is another example of where Vice President Biden has laid out plans, has talked about what he's going to do, has talked about his outreach, certainly his leadership on the Foreign Policy Committee, the work that he did as vice president gives you an indication of how he would lead globally. And I think there's more comfort in that than what the inaction that you've seen and the missteps that you've seen on foreign policy out of this current administration.
Amy, I wanted to profit from your experience, leading the National Democratic Committee. You know so well the party inside out. So far, Joe Biden has been able to create this synergy between different sensitivities, different wings of the party, more centrist, more left-leaning. When it comes to governing, however, and perhaps we need a second webinar to discuss this, do you think he's going to repeat the modern instincts of President Obama? He's going to follow that lead? Or do you think he's going to also reach out to the left of the party, to the more progressive side of the party, the younger group, but also, Bernie Sanders followers?
I think it's important. You saw the coalescing and some advantages. I think for the party in 2020 was the presumptive nominee was named earlier. You saw this coalescing, people working together. We had a very robust primary season, a lot of different people running. They very much showed their support to Vice President Biden early and asked their supporters to do so. I think one of the big differences is it's not enough to say, I'm supporting, but to ask the people who supported you in the primary, please understand what's at stake here. I'm supporting, the nominee. You need to support the nominee, which I think is really essential. I do think that we talked a little bit, before we started the webinar, that campaigns are about differences. They are about whether it's a primary campaign or a general election. You're talking about what makes you different from the opponent. Governing is about consensus and finding solutions by bringing forces, together. I think that's where the leadership styles and the character will come into play. I think you've seen a long history of public service with not only, we've talked so much about Vice President Biden, but his running mate, Kamala Harris, and their styles about inclusivity, I think bringing people to the table. I do think you will see Vice President Biden wants an administration that listens to experts and listens to a lot of voices. At the end of the day, somebody has to make decisions, and decisions they think are the best for the country and the values of the party and individuals that he represents. He said he's representing everybody, but I do think you'll see a more open and inclusive conversation around these issues, not only domestically, but internationally as well, if there's differing ideas there. Again, a lot of time, especially in debates, especially on the campaign trail, it's character and it's how individuals would govern. And you're seeing those differences, as well, just the styles of leadership as well. And I do think that you will see his governing style will lend much better to a country that needs to heal and come together and work together to find solutions to some of the greatest problems that we've seen in the US and globally as well. It won't be easy, though. I don't mean to underestimate. I mean, I think the other thing that you've seen historically is when you win, and if Democrats win the Senate, sometimes it's harder to govern when you're governing everything because the expectations will be high about what you can achieve in those environments. But I think Democrats and progressives would rather have that conversation and go down that road than the alternative, for sure.
Thank you.
Well, we will have time to talk about the government in our next session with you, but let's keep talking about the campaign, no? Let's see what's happening. We have two questions which are they're very typical and very important at the same time. One is, how do you see the Latino vote issue, which is also always regarded and followed from Spain. We all speak the same language. Mm-hmm. And the other question is regarding women votes, difference between men and women votes, and what you think may happen regarding these two groups, two way of differentiating votes. Thank you.
I thank you for that question, because I think the important thing to note is what a huge number of eligible voters are women, a huge number of eligible voters, and a growing part of our electorate the Latino community in the United States. I will say this as somebody who's worked and been an operative for a couple of decades in politics. One mistake we make sometimes as operatives is to treat both of these communities as a monolith. And I don't think you can do that. And I think what you've seen in 2016, some of the early indicators are, positive in some parts of the Hispanic community for Democrats. When you see, especially when I mentioned, some of those early voting in the youth, Hispanic young voters were up 459% voting early. And I think there's a tendency for them to vote more, progressive in some of these issues. But again, as I say, the Latino community is different sometimes in Florida versus the Southwest versus some other pockets. And so I think in a good way, the campaign is having very targeted conversations around issues that they care about. And I think that they are doing a good job about understanding the role that the issue of immigration plays for this community, but also understanding that there's other issues that matter and are of great importance. And you have to speak to them about a lot of these issues, economic issues, education for their children, taking care of their seniors. So I think in a way, making sure they're not treated as a monolith and talking to those communities where you are with the surrogates and peer-to-peer that resonate with them is very important. And then again, as somebody who worked at Emily's List and has worked in the women's community for a long time, I think having a woman, especially a woman of color on the ticket for the Democratic Party is historic. But again, in the United States, party is much more an indicator than gender on all the polling analysis has shown. So what we're looking at is these white suburban women who voted, against Hillary Clinton in 2016, some of these college educated women that voted, white women that voted against Hillary Clinton, how are they going to act in this election? Certainly communities of color, women of color, are they going to be supporting, this ticket? So again, not treating it as a monolith, talking to them about issues that they care about, whether they are married and have, children and are raising a family or taking care of older family members or single, and dealing with, issues of economic security. Again, we have to look, and why having these resources that the Democratic campaign has, both the campaign and outside groups, to have these individual conversations will really matter. And so it'd be interesting to hear from you, especially about, anybody's thoughts on the call about the Latina vote. But I do think there are pockets across the country, the conversations that they're having are really important. And I do think that not only the party, but the campaign are looking at these communities very seriously, putting resources toward them and trying to have the conversations they need to have to make sure that they vote Democratic on and before Election Day.
Thank you, Amy. We have a participant that is saying that this is a great session, and he's asking if it's a close finish, do you think that Trump could challenge the results? Could we walk into that nightmare scenario?
I do think that, a close election could, keep this going for several days. If there's a large margin in Florida that's beneficial for the Biden campaign, I think it'll be harder to make the argument that, there's votes out there to be counted. It is, certainly math. I think in some of these states that I mentioned that we're going to have to wait for ballots to be counted. But I wrote an article recently, and I need to remind people about the scenario. States, the Federal Register, the archives play an important role in this. And there's 2 days that really matter after election days as well. On December 14th, the electors come together in the Electoral College and will vote. And then in January 6th, the Congress will certify that election. So these moments are important as we look. Election day is certainly the first and foremost of importance. But the work that has to get done individually, state by state, to certify their elections, to get the electors to vote, and then also to get Congress to certify that. Those are date specific. They're in the, in parts of the Constitution and some of the federal standings, and they have to happen. So again, I think that narrow margins will make it harder. And I do think that, somebody will, certainly say every vote has to be counted and we can wait, but it remains to be seen where these margins will be, but those dates are very important because those have to happen according to our Constitution and within the Federal Register, so.
Okay, more questions. really screaming you. We have one question saying that, well, you said before that Vice President Biden wants to control the virus, then put the economy back to work, and then extend healthcare. No? And that's like the path. No? That's his main project that he's putting forward. We have a question from a viewer saying that how is his healthcare proposal? Is it basically going back to Obamacare initial project, or are there any differences or any well, something that you can tell us about it?
Well, I won't say that I'm a healthcare policy expert, but from what I've read and certainly what I know, it's preserving the key tactics and parts of Obamacare that really matter to people around pre-existing conditions, around access to healthcare through your employer. These are things that, although Trump has tried to go out and say he's protecting them, he's literally trying to chip away at some of the most important parts that opened up access to healthcare. And then I think the question is, where can it be improved? Because even when the bill was first passed, a big coalition of people came together to pass that. So it's like the Medicare proposals, like the provisions, like where are the places that you can expand it, and to make sure that, small business owners and others who have to provide the healthcare as well, how are we making sure that, especially in some of these trying economic times, that people have access to healthcare, that they can expand it to people that, might not be insured, and then they won't penalize, small businesses that are also trying to take care of their employees, but also, stay afloat during this. So I encourage you to go to his website, because I think he's very clearly laid out, as he said in the last debate, expanding it to Biden care. But I think the first and foremost is to make sure to protect those provisions that were fought so hard for in Obamacare, and where you can expand and help protect, individuals who want to and are part of the process of making sure that their employers have healthcare. But again, he's really, in a difference from certainly President Trump and his team, who has not laid out a healthcare plan as an alternative to Obamacare. I think Biden's shown how he's going to protect what's existing and then try to expand and improve some of the areas where many people have said that there's an opportunity to do that.
Amy, we have a participant from, a suburb near Philadelphia, and she says that there's never been an election in which the suburban female movement has had such great power as this one we're seeing right now, and that, in her opinion, this is clearly leaning towards Biden-Harris, at least in her area. So could you tell us a little bit more about this suburban female movement, and why, the law and order promises of President Trump are not being greeted with enthusiasm, and other concerns are really moving this demographic group?
I think that the division that President Trump is trying to create is not playing well with a lot of individuals. And I think that's a core piece of it. I also think that it's funny in a way that when you're the sitting president, that you try to be the law and order. This is happening on his watch. These are happening in communities all across the country under his administration. And so, to try and deflect and say he's there to fix it, and then to blame it on local elected officials who've asked for help, who've asked for, assistance in trying to figure out some of the solutions that have created, some of these conversations, and his unwillingness to literally talk about this in a way and say that we've got challenges, and we've had challenges in this country for a long time, and we have to have an open dialogue about this. I think for me, what I'm seeing is that it might have been going too far, and this tone and tenor that he tried to use in 2016. People want to respect, the office of the president, and they want to feel good about the decisions and the demeanor of, who their president is. And I think some of that bravado you saw as a candidate in 2016 is not resonating well with some of these, suburban women and others, and trying to play into your communities are at risk, and I think it's hard to picture that Vice President Biden, who also has a long history in police enforcement and supporting, law enforcement in many ways, is not trying to say that you can hold them accountable and figure out better ways for policing, and at the same time work together to figure that out. So I think it's more solution driven, and I think it's resonating with a lot of these suburban women. And that first debate, I think just what they saw and just that behavior and the literally the way President Trump handled that first debate didn't sit well for some individuals.
Thank you.
Well, that's very interesting. And it's not only, we have other questions, it's not only the suburban women. I think it's the whole progressive and the center and the communities. I was with Matt Browne, and we went to Philadelphia 4 years ago, also Charlotte and Denver. So, but now during all this year, nobody's traveling, and it's not so easy to get the feeling of what's going on among people. But in Philadelphia, it was easy to see that the Democratic community was not very well taken along with each other. Now today is Tuesday, so we are 6 days away from election day almost. How strong is this? Do you think there are any risks in the coming days towards that, or there's going to be very high mobilization and everybody's going to be there on Tuesday, regardless of differences within the left or within progressives, within Democrats?
Right. Well, I think you can't take anything for granted, not only in this election cycle, but in any election cycle. I mean, I've been on local races where election day came and it was raining and we thought that was going to affect turnout. And so you're nervous, about everything. We used to have an October surprise, and one day during October, something unusual happened that could shake up the campaign. I feel like I wake up every morning right now and say, what's today's October surprise? So I think there's a lot that can happen in these, final days. I think there's still a lot of people who have not voted who will make a decision if they are going to vote in the next 6 days and on election day. There's still certainly an audience to reach and try to encourage them on both sides to vote. So, like I said, polls are only a indication and a snapshot in time. They're not a prediction of what's going to happen on election day. So there's a lot that can happen. And one thing that we didn't talk about that I think it's important to talk about is I think the campaigns are both finding ways in a more limited environment of campaigning than we've seen to try and get your message out. I've always said that campaigns are just conversations with voters. They've been since the beginning of time. What changes is who's having the conversation, what you're having the conversation about, and how you're having that conversation. And the how is important. I think traditional door-to-door, you're seeing it in some places you're not. I mean, the limitations that some of, COVID-19's had on some things like you've seen. So these are all challenges that there's still a lot of unknowns about who's turning out on election, how these will be affected. So I think in the coming days, seeing where these candidates are actually traveling to, making sure that they're using their resources to have very targeted conversations, and the outside spending and outside groups that will also get involved, which is a part of our current process, will can change a lot of the dynamic today versus, Wednesday versus Thursday versus Friday this week and going up until election day. And if it rains, if it snows, I
wanted to touch upon the subject of climate change, climate emergency. In many countries, the pandemic has distracted us from this huge menace and what we can still do about it. And there are very sharp contrasts between the two candidates when it comes to climate emergency, to fighting climate change. So could you tell us a little bit more about how this is resonating with different parts of the electorate?
Yeah, I think this is where you might see some of the surge in the youth vote. It's certainly been polling as a very popular topic with young, Americans. But I also think that there's parts of the country that have seen rollbacks of some of the things that the Obama administration did for, the environment. I think everybody is seeing this in a different way, that it's not something that environment that just some people care about, but that it actually affects our day-to-day lives. It affects our economy, affects a lot of the things that are happening to us nationally. So there are targeted conversations, happening with certainly voters that care about that. You saw it brought up, in the debate, and if you listen to President Trump, the birds hate the wind power, they're in danger. But like, I think this is one example of on these policies, one campaign has a very clear plan, not only about restoring things that happened in the administration that he worked for, but also looking forward about what needs to happen. And then the administration itself has not defined these clearly and has not put out proposals about what this means. So it's definitely one where strike.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I got a puppy during COVID, and so I think we're hearing her a little more than we did before, so I apologize.
No, we have a dogs are welcome policy in our debates. So.
Yes, it's very Aspen.
And Juan is a big dog person.
Now, Matt Browne is going to ask you a question or going to make a comment. Thanks, Matt.
I
wasn't prepared for this.
I will ask a question. I would not be so presumptuous as to make a comment, but my question is this: the Democrats seem to have a lead in early voting, though it may be less of a lead than they had last time around, depending on which numbers you're looking at. What's also clear is that the voter registration numbers aren't quite as strong as they have been on the Democrat side in previous times. Now, a lot of people put this down to the fact that perhaps put this down to the fact that we're living in a period of the pandemic, and that there was a decision made on the part of Biden's campaign and the Democratic Party more broadly not to do door-to-door canvassing at this time. But this was not the strategy chosen by Trump or the Republicans. They have actually gone out and organized on the ground. So do you think that is the reason why we're seeing weaker voter registration numbers? And do you think it's a mistake on the part of the campaign not to do this? I mean, I know there was a risk. Obviously, the risk of canvases being super spreaders is much more dangerous for a political party that believes the pandemic is serious, as opposed to that which believes that it isn't. But there is a case to say that it's put us at a disadvantage in certain places.
Well, it's certainly something that's been a strength of the Democratic Party, this peer-to-peer conversation, going door to door. It's not something I think the campaign doesn't want to have as a tool to use. I don't think it's, I think there's still a lot of volume of communication, whether it's, with phones, with digital, I do think it's something that they would love to have, to their advantage. I do think in some of these, I don't think it's always been a core part of the Republican strategy to register more voters. It's always been, focused on turning out the voters that they have. I will caution, and I share your concern. We've talked about this, Matt, Pennsylvania, Florida, narrowing the registration advantage in these states for Democrats. I don't like that on the front end. But I also think that the important thing is that Democrats are using their resources to turn out those voters. And I always say that registering to vote doesn't mean you're voting. You have to have a plan to vote. And I've seen the Democratic Party and its allies pushing about having a plan to vote, finding ways that voters will, make sure that they have a plan and to get out there. I do think that at the end of the day, they would prefer to have it. I think they're making smart, decisions based on, the well-being of individuals. I don't know if those registration numbers are where it remains to be seen if all those, additional Republicans that were registered are going to turn out to vote. And I don't know in the Republican strategy is if they're using their resources to help them make a plan, or if this is just messaging to those individuals about why it's important. You can't just say why it's important to vote. You have to help voters find a plan, because it's complicated. Also, we have 50 different versions plus 7 in different territories about how you do that in your local community. So I don't like seeing that. I mean, you'd rather have that advantage going in. And I think they'd rather see their ability to go door to door. I know in some communities they are deciding to do that, not on the national level, but also on the local level. We talked a little bit about this. I think where it's an even bigger disadvantage is in down ballot races, where candidates don't have these unlimited resources like you're seeing with the Biden campaign. Challengers to incumbents who counted on going to those county fairs, counted on going to those individual, events, the real grassroots politics. That could have an impact on some of these local races. Whether or not this is going to have a bigger impact, on the national campaign, I think remains to be seen. But I do think they prefer to use it for sure.
Amy, I wanted to go back to foreign policy. I know it's not the most popular subject on the campaign, but from the outside, we're deeply worried about this, isolationism, this, diminishing role of the U.S. In world affairs that already started, with President Obama, but for very different reasons, and now has really created a vacuum of power. So if you could, I don't know, this is a long question, but I'm asking you just for very, concrete answers on China, on Russia, on the invisible Europe.
Well, I think it's important to note, and if one thing could come out of this global pandemic that we've seen, I think people have a better understanding that borders don't end at their community or their, but this is both internationally. I mean, I think more so people have seen how when countries aren't talking to each other, when they don't have good relations, that, things like a global pandemic don't see borders. They don't stop. They don't, look at the diplomatic relations between two countries and make decisions. So that interconnectivity globally, I think, is important, and people will see that. I think you've also seen that on the local level. I think, for me personally, I watch my local news more than I ever have before. And that's because that's where I'm actually getting the day-to-day information about, where I can go, what I can do. And so I think also voters in the US are seeing what mayors, what governors, what state legislatures, what kind of impact they have on their day-to-day life. So going back to the foreign policy, I think it's seeing that this is important, that if you break down and don't have good relations and you don't have open lines of communications, something that's happening in somewhere else in the world can affect you. You're not, as individuals, not affected by these things. And so I think there might be a hunger for a leader who then is willing to have those conversations, willing to have, where they need to be, tough with certain countries or state, what they think is important or what the boundaries are, but in the same time, willing to have a conversation and understand what's going on to help prevent, things from happening or trying to work together to find, solutions to do that as well. I think a great example is when you saw like Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, him and his wife going over and finding masks and doing and literally going over to Korea and finding these and making it going, not using the national government. It's very interesting, the solution driven. How do you find the answer to these problems if you don't have good relations? And so I think it's put that on the conversation table in a way internationally, but also I've seen it locally as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're running out of questions. I have a last one from myself, no? And then Jose Maria will, and the public will also, we may have some Q&A. There is, over here in the side of the Atlantic, there is some concern about what is called maybe Trump's hidden vote. That after all, the anger and the anxiety that you talk about before among many people is still there, especially after the results of the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic, and that may still be there surviving despite all the disastrous management of many issues. What do you think? And this will be our last question from the part and from.
I'm so glad you asked that, Juan, because it's a very good question, because I think we saw this a lot in 2016. People not willing to admit that they were going to vote or that they were going to vote for Trump or that they were, said that they were going to vote the Democrat and didn't. I think this is why I caution that polls are not an indicator of how people are going to act, but a snapshot in time, because, polling I think polling in a lot of ways helps campaigns decide where to move their resources or where to shift the conversations based on, where they see more support, where they might see less support. But I do think that, listen, at the end of the day, there's still a lot of people who like Trump or don't like Trump, like for their party to be in power. And so I do think some of those might be a part of the hidden vote. I do think some of those individuals might share, certainly some of the sentiments that you see President Trump unfortunately spewing out there. And I hate to think it, but they're more likely to vote. And the great thing is that our votes are, confidential, and that this is the way the system, here is set up. But it also makes polling indicators, you know, why you can't take anything for granted and have to have conversations and pull out the voters that you know, are voting for you. I think that's why, again, this red mirage you could see on election day, we don't know how great that turnout could be, you know, for Republicans, and why it's important to keep an eye on that, and why I don't take anything, you know, for granted. Even if you see a Democratic advantage in some of these states with early voting, there's a lot more road to cover here, and there's a lot more we'll be learning on election day. But as I said, I'm cautiously optimistic. Like, you know, I think this campaign's doing, you know, a great job. I think you see in difficult times, people having this conversation. I think there's a lot of factors that are different than 2016 that could possibly favor a challenger, you know, and a Democrat, you know, in this race. But again, there's a lot of unknowns. And so I don't see, you hear, you know, I've talked to a lot of campaign officials, a lot of people on the inside, on the Democratic side, and they're not taking their foot, you know, off the gas. They know that they have to do this right up until the last poll closes on election day.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you.
This has been a great conversation. I like a lot your definition of what a campaign is, a conversation with voters. I also love the distinction you make between campaigning, emphasizing difference, and governing, yes, finding consensus. You know, I've learned a lot from all of you. Thank you so much, Matt, for making this possible. And thank you, Juan and Deusto. And
thank you.
Hope to get together again soon and continue with this exploration of ideas, of, you know, facts, and you know, let's see what happens in the next days, hours. Thank
yes.
you all.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good luck this week.
So thank you all.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Yeah.
So long.